Hey, what's up, investors? My name is Devin Moreno, and I'm a Baltimore City investor whom started out trying to figure out how to work best with contractors and what type of contractor to hire for what type of job. You might be surprised to hear that you can't just simply hire a handyman or a plumber for any issue. You actually need what I think is about 4 different types of main categories of contractors in order to get through your entire real estate adventure like I'm doing today. So if for those of you who don't know, I actually own 17 properties in this area, in this Baltimore City, DC area, one in Ohio, but an offshoot of things. And essentially throughout that time, I have tried to figure out exactly when I can rely on a contractor for what particular task. And it is actually quite a bit more difficult than it might seem. So you're gonna need your cheap contractors. You're gonna need your one-man shows, what I'm gonna call them for this video. You're gonna need your general contractors and your big businesses. So I'm gonna show you the 4 applications of which I would call each one of them, because I definitely would not call one for all purposes unless I just have a fantastic relationship with a very good contractor. But if you have that, you have a really good gold mine in your hands. So as you know, it's hard to find good contractors. So let's figure out how we can turn these contractors who have flaws into good contractors per the situation. So the first one I want to talk about is the cheap contractor. Now, this can have a couple different variations. That can be a single individual who just works for himself. This can be something with someone with a crew. However, these cheap contractors, you have to understand, are going to go out of business. It's a matter of time. So do not hire them for big jobs. Now, you might wonder, why are they going to go out of business? Well, it's often said that if a contractor is not charging a minimum 50% of what it costs to do the job, that's minimum. They're often encouraged to charge 200% of what it costs to do the job, then they will go out of business. Actually, myself, I have a contracting company as well, and I've learned that even just charging 35% on the job, you are not making enough money. Now, the problem is these cheap contractors haven't figured out a way to optimize the performance of their crew, and that's why they can't charge you double. They can't charge you 50% or whatever on top, because it would then be a price so absurd that nobody would pay it. So until they figure out how to optimize a crew, they're stuck paying cheap pricing. And while they continue to do that, they're not going to be able to afford any type of emergency. So anything that comes up, divorce, trucks going down, anything, all that, once it happens, once they figure out that they cannot keep this up because they charge you too low of a price, they're going to abandon you on the job. So this goes into my point of, okay, why do you use them in general? Well, of course, because they're cheap. So basically, we want to use them for incremental pieces of a job. Don't hire them for your big job. So if someone's giving you a very absurdly cheap quote for a very big job, instead break that job up as much as possible and hire them for segments. Okay, and this is very important, because if you don't break it up into segments, then they're going to ask for a 1/3 deposit on the entire job. Like, seriously. They're going to do this to you, where you're going to see, like, okay, you want them to just put on the granite countertop. And then they're going to be like, well, don't you need to do this? And don't you need to do that? And don't you need to do that? And by the time they're done adding up all these different things you can do, because they can do everything. They always can do everything. And so that's one of your general signs of it. Not that they have a guy who can do it, or, like the general contractors we're going to talk about later, but they personally can do it. That's usually a sign that they probably can't do anything well, but whatever, we'll go off of that. You generally, if you don't break that job up, then they're going to do what I call deposit hunting. So if they go deposit hunting, that means they are using your deposit to pay for the last person's job, because they're running out of money on that job. You know why? Because they charged a price that was way too cheap. So a lot of these newer contractors are the ones who do this. For the investors, we like the cheap pricing, sure, but you just have to keep that in mind. Now, if you are going to give them a 1/3 deposit, oftentimes you want to charge with a credit card. That's because then you can remove the payment if they don't actually perform the job. But lo and behold, most of these cheap contractors don't accept credit cards and often want you to pay them in cash or Cash App or something that is non-refundable. So just keep that in mind. I would break up the job, make them only do little chunks at a time, so when they finally disappear, you're not too worried about it. Don't expect them to do the entire job, and if they do the entire job, do not expect them to do it well. The cheap contractors who stay in business for a long time, maybe like 2 years is actually pretty long for them, it's usually because we're overlooking little details that they screw up. So just keep that in mind, especially if they say they can do everything. Once again, they're not going to do anything well. So, Obviously, don't be a dick. You knew you got a cheap price. So not to say that all cheap contractors, by the way, do a bad job, okay? This is a general rule. Make sure that you, of course, variate it per person. The next person I'm going to talk about is kind of almost what I was alluding to. So it's a one-man show. So this is kind of your handyman you're going to use to interact with tenants. Okay, this is more often, all right? We're going to divide this into two categories because some of these contractors often aren't very good at working with tenants. Maybe they don't speak English. That's often the time where that kind of becomes a problem. Just being real here. But ultimately, if they are able to interact with the tenant, they speak English, and they can work with the tenant. These are the ones you're often going to hire for those type of jobs. It's the ones that go into a tenant's house and work with the tenant. Now, these contractors are often the ones you're going to call the most. The problem is they are a one-man show, and oftentimes, like any human, they get tired, they get on a job too long, they underestimated how long a job goes, so they said they'll get to your job next, and then they don't. So then they are very, very unreliable. Sure, their pricing is fair, maybe not super cheap, but fair, and they are the best one to go into that situation. But oftentimes, if I'm dealing with a situation where I need to hire my one-man shows to a job for a tenant, I will often hire 3 of them. I will actually schedule out like 3 different contractors because it is that likely that they're not going to show up to the job, even though they told you that's when they're going to show up. So this is especially true if they give you a specific time. Make sure they give ranges of times. If they don't give a range of time, let's say they say show up at noon, tell the tenant they're going to show up sometime between 11 and 4 or whatever. Do not actually give a specific time because they're going to be unreliable most of the time. I schedule out these 3 contractors, and when one of them shows up, I cancel all the remaining ones, maybe later that day or the next day or whatnot. Trust me, you're going to have a hell of a time if you don't do this, because if the guy doesn't show up for whatever reason, most of the time they're going to want to avoid confrontations. You're going to stop answering your phone call. You have no idea what's going on. When you finally figure it out, you're probably going to yell at them. They're never going to answer your phone call again because they're very sensitive to you yelling at them over this period of stress. So, that all aside, the tenant's going to be yelling at you because they're going to be like, well, you told me that this contractor is going to show up at this time. And, sounds absurd, but unfortunately, most of the tenants kind of act like you own these contractors. So that's my usual recommendation, is just hire out a bunch of them. So that way, if one doesn't show up, you have one the very next evening or very next morning or something of that sort. So that's my one-man shows. You're going to end up hiring them most of the time. When I say one man, generally, though, they still have like maybe outlying crew, people they pick up once in a while. They still have people who help them out occasionally. So that's them, and that's what they're useful for. The next one is your general contractors. So general contractors are the ones who have an assortment of different guys, all right? So they generally have their own crews, but they also have subs whom are like electricians and other tradesmen whom they hire. So they never tell you they can do everything. That's actually a good thing. You don't want someone who thinks they can do everything, okay? So now we know we're getting much more efficient quality. I would generally only hire them for your biggest jobs. Now, unfortunately, they will charge 20% on top of everything, and then the smallest jobs are just really not worth their time. To just change a light bulb, they'd have to charge you $200 just to make it make any sense. These are people who actually run their businesses effectively. They run it efficiently. They are going to stay in business a long time. And honestly, for that reason, you need a couple of these people in your back pocket, especially for your big gut jobs and your renovations, which we have all the time here in Baltimore City. So ultimately with them, though, working with them can be tricky because if they're very, very good, you got to schedule them out for months. You generally want to try to develop a relationship with them. So oftentimes I say pay the price, and then they'll be a lot more responsive to you and your needs. So that's the one thing, is if they're very, very good, yeah, they're never going to show up. If they do show up a lot, then oftentimes it can be hard to get them back onto the job. So the biggest problem I found with a lot of these general contractors is they hate punch-out lists. So they usually won't finish it to the end, especially if they give you a reasonable investor price. And then you'll have to bring back in your one-man shows, or maybe even your cheap contractors, to kind of fix up little details that they might have left behind, because it's just too expensive to pull their crew off the next job back to your job. And they're going to start thinking in their mind the money, okay? It's probably a little bit better to just not deal with you and maybe the shelf that you wanted installed a particular way. Don't harass them on that. You're just going to ruin a relationship. Just get someone else to come back up behind them and fix all that cheap punch out list stuff. Not a problem. Factor it into your budget. So the fourth category we're going to talk about is your big companies. Now, these are not your general contractors with their own crews. These are your Len the Plumbers and the giant corporate, organizations where all these contractors work on commission, and then they charge you just a ton of money. They are easily the most expensive category, and this is where homeowners get screwed left and right by these big companies. It's because they're the ones you're finding on Google. Often my rule is, if you can find the contractor on Google, they're probably too expensive to work on your renovation. Probably, but most of the time, yeah. So, okay, then why mention these people at all if they're so terrible in pricing? This is for your emergency issues. If you're going to have an issue like an HVAC system going out and they don't have heat in the winter, or you're going to have an issue like water flooding the basement, well, these are the people you're going to call because they're on staff 24/7, or they have reliable people where you can often, get on the phone with them and have like someone answer the phone. Sure, it might be a ticketing system. The bigger the company, generally the more reliable it tends to be-ish. I know, probably everyone's had an issue with some of these companies, but in comparison to all the other groups that I just mentioned, they're going to be your most responsive, especially since oftentimes responding to you means a very large paycheck for the contractor. So you're going to need to work with them. Like I said, emergency issues only. Most things with a tenant are not emergencies as much as they think, but I would say categories like that, flooding, heat in the winter, stuff like that, those are things I generally want to leap on, and I don't want to deal with calling a bunch of one-man shows to try to get one of them to show up to fix the issue. Now, the last thing that probably relates to all of the contractors is paying them. I actually pay my contractors in a variety of different ways, but most of them are going to want checks, which is fairly annoying, right? So, because you have to now meet the contractor at certain times. If you can pay with credit cards, I always recommend it because credit cards is something you can actually cancel. But if you have to give them a check, oftentimes we'll pick locations where you can leave the check for them to pick up. Make sure they always take pictures, regardless of who they are. Make them take pictures of the job. Reinforce that. Remind that. They will always forget this detail. It's very annoying. And do this across all the different 4 categories of contractors. And trust me, you'll have a much better time dealing with contractors if you follow this advice and use the 4 contractors for exactly what they're intended.